thanks for coming tonight for this very exciting panel about globalization and literature. So first, well, I'm going to apologize for my English and my French accent. Okay, so now that it's done, I think we can start. So we have the pleasure to have with us tonight Urvashi Butalia, Vishakha Desai, and Akeel Bilgrami. So tonight's topic is a very intricate and very exciting topic. But globalization wasn't born today, and we can say it's a very old idea, which harks back to the 19th century, even before. But maybe the high point of conceptualization about globalization and literature came from the 19th century and could be traced back to Goethe and his phrase Weltliteratur. Goethe envisioned a world literature, a Weltliteratur, that would be a dialogue between the nations, something that came straight from the Enlightenment. So I was wondering, is today's globalization in literature an offspring of Goethe's thought or not? So feel free to start.
We will start. First of all, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I think this very conversation, some of you who were in the previous panel that Urvashi was part of as well, we also looked at, which is this a new phenomenon? Or is this something we've always done? People have been interested in other cultures for a long time. So Goethe is one, but of course, if you think about Tagore and his interest and his reception in Paris, goes back to 1927, and after Gitanjali, everybody can say this is the same. Or is it the same? And I would say that in three ways, the phenomenon of today is a bit different. It's in scale, it's in scope, and it is in speed. And in each one of these three categories, the way things are connected, the way we are actually going back and forth is actually different. So it is not just because it's more, but the nature of circulation of ideas and forms is a bit different. And it's fair to say that as a result, it used to be that there were very select few who actually, Goethe being again one of those people, who was very deeply connected to other parts of the world and in interconnection. Today there is some democratization of this idea, as much about movement of people as it's about movement of ideas. That also is different, and therefore it makes for far more messy, complex, and somewhat different experience of literature and the global world than where we were 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if this difference, not only in scale, but in nature, which underscored, how does it bear on the mere fact of writing, of creating? Do the writers, is the condition of the writers, is the relationship of the writers to their work changed by this new globalization in literature? What do you think?
Akeel, what do you think?
You know, I have only instincts on the subject. I don't have any detailed scholarly knowledge of the globalization of literature in particular, but my sense is that I think a question we ought to ask is, when is it, say, a novelist began to write for an audience that was more than 200 miles around him or her? When did that first begin to happen? And I suspect that was really quite late in the 20th century. That somebody like Pamuk, say, or somebody like Rushdie, wrote with a reader in mind who could be pretty much anywhere. They were assured of translation because of their fame and celebrity, and a sensibility had emerged which was yearning for a novel that had an idiom that was global, characters that traveled easily, maybe Marquez, but certainly Rushdie and Pamuk started something. The way I think we ought to wonder about is, and this is put to you, Vishakha, in particular, because of your knowledge of the visual arts, is that I don't know how one could think of this in institutional terms, but in the arts, the Biennale is prima facie an international phenomenon. And it occurred in the late 19th century for the first. That's 100 years before Pamuk and Rushdie. So what is it about the visual that translating it across a culture doesn't seem to require the formal apparatus of actual translation? People can assume they're translating, even if it's an illusion that they are succeeding in doing it. But they instinctively think they can get it. And the idea that there could be some counterpart to the Biennale in literature comes with festivals of a certain kind, I suppose, which also a very recent phenomenon. So it's a good thing to try and compare these.
Well, I mean, I do think, and I want to make sure that Urvashi gets into this conversation too, but I think, first of all, we mustn't forget that Venice Biennale, which is sort of the mother of all biennales, essentially was not a global phenomenon. It is an ultranational phenomenon where national pavilions came together to be looked at. It was to project the nation on an international stage.
But presumably it could have a dialogical relation too.
Not at all. Not in the 19th century. Then, on the other hand, you do have something about the visual arts where the perception, whether it's a reality or not, is that visual arts have the capacity to be off a place but transcend a place because it does not require language. Yeah. It's in that sense a little bit like music, but particularly in the visual arts. We all know that that's actually a false idea because even in the visual arts there is specificity of linguistic, the vocabulary is very specific and we could misinterpret something. So I think we do have to remember that that phenomenon of the 19th century is not so much the same global phenomenon that you're talking about with Rushdie or with Orhan Pamuk, whose own experience is transnational.
So what is the aspiration of the Biennale then?
Is to promote the national agenda. Mind you, it's in fact France, Italy, Germany, and England. England is relatively late. Is to promote their idea of a nationhood on that stage, and Italians trying to project it as their power. So it has a much more of a nationalist agenda in terms of the actual creation of Biennale in the early stages.
But no aspiration that we are bringing together different things.
Exactly.
You're very confident about this.
Because I've actually done some studies. So the point is that it's who is doing what work, how can I show my culture in this particular capacity. So it's less dialogical, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you agree that there's been a change in nature as much as a change in scale as far as literary globalization is concerned?
Yes, I think definitely there's been a change in both nature and scale. I would place the global movement of writing and literature long before the sort of dates that you're giving them. I would say that in the early centuries, there were any number of travelers who traveled to different parts of the world, following trade patterns and also following religious curiosity. I mean, Buddhism drew a lot of scholars, travelers to countries like India to see what it was about this religion. They followed the path of the Buddha, they wrote about it. And the knowledge that they had of our parts of the world grew from something, some written sources. So in a sense, I think there were things traveling back and forth. And this has continued to happen over the centuries. What we are seeing today is a much more rapid and a much more, an increase in volume, expedited by the advances of technology, and also by the political changes in the world, where centers of power have shifted. You no longer have a unipolar world with the United States at the head, even though it still is, but the thing is, things are changing. New countries are coming up, new economies are emerging, and writers in those places are more confident of expressing themselves. And publishing is taking a look at that as well. And in terms of what you said about the Biennale, there, in the world of the written word, there have been traditional places where knowledge is exchanged, one of them being the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is now in its 70th or 75th year, I forget exactly what. So these happen. I think the change that I see now is that despite the fact that the flow of information has gone back and forth, in volume it has been pretty much one-sided, because of course it has followed history and patterns of power. So it is always the West or the North, however you typify it, which has had much more access to countries like ours, where their literatures have been available, and local literatures therefore have had difficulty in confidently growing. Now I think that true globalization happens when, let's say, a writer from Orissa feels confident of writing a story about a supermarket in Germany. That curiosity and that writerly imagination can make that leap, and that the world of reading can receive that leap. That's where true globalization becomes, if you like. Otherwise, what happens is, there's a writer, an American writer, who was a correspondent with the Washington Post in India, Elizabeth Boumiller. She wrote a book which was hugely successful called May You Be the Mother of 100 Sons. And she said she wrote the book after visiting a village in India and spending over a period of a month, spending time there, interviewing women. She interviewed 20 or 25 women. I calculated the number of hours she had spent in that village with each woman. The total number of hours over 1 month was 28. And she wrote a book which became the definitive knowledge about Indian women's desire to be mothers of 100 sons. Now, can you imagine an Indian woman in that time, 20 years ago, standing outside a supermarket in the United States, interviewing 20 customers and writing the definitive book about American motherhood? It would have been inconceivable. And that's what makes that one-sidedness of globalization makes it possible for works created in the countries of power to be received in those countries which cannot compete in ways and power as legit works. The other way around doesn't work so well, but it has started happening now for all these reasons. And when it starts to happen, that's when we're really talking about a much more egalitarian flow of ideas, if you like.
You used the term one-sidedness, which brings me to another topic pertaining to globalization. This is the topic of translation. it's well known, it's rather well known that, for instance, in the United States, if you look at the figures of translation, you realize that the vernacular languages from India, for instance, are underrepresented, if not translated at all. And do you have an explanation for this? Does it mean that English is the language of globalization? I'd like to know a little more about it.
Yeah. Urvashi has much more to say about this than, in fact, any one of us, because she's been doing so much translation. But I do think that there's two kinds of issues around translation. One is the translation as in real translation of the language. The other one is translation of ideas, which is more about reception of content. That's another kind of translation. Mm-hmm. And we probably need to look at both of them. And it is true that I think in the States especially, and we were talking about this before, that in France there is some interest in trying to get more translations. In the States, we are such a monolingual culture, even though it is not the reality of the culture, that, nobody really wants to bother to, in fact, learn about other languages. And there's so much available in English that people say, well, why should I do that? Just to give you a little anecdote, in my previous life, we were working on international education and learning Chinese. And major television station, a very educated journalist who says to me, well, why should anybody learn Chinese? Everybody, no matter where I go, they all speak English. And I said, has it ever occurred to you that part of it is to show some respect and curiosity about other parts of the world? And I think that goes back to the kind of hegemonic power and therefore some arrogance of power. But also, US is so big as a country that it kind of gets away with it. And as a result, I think it is fair to say that other vernacular writers don't always get their voices. On the other hand, because of the non-resident Indian or the diaspora community, there's a huge amount of going back and forth of specific language, so that I know, I come from Gujarat, from Ahmedabad, there are Gujarati poets and writers coming and going and doing Gujarati melas and conferences and things of that sort. So there is a sub-level of conversation which is not even translation. It's direct language. It's true of Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, you name it. So we need to also pay attention to that, which is not just about the mainstream and what happens at that level. Urvashi has, maybe you should say something about the translation in France, possibly, and what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I think we should first of all forget about the United States. Just marginalize it, cast it aside. But having said that, I think the truth is that all book markets are very parochial, very locally interested, and it takes quite a lot of doing to create a curiosity about foreign literatures. And then that curiosity can only be satisfied if you have the infrastructure or the possibility or the opportunities to translate those literatures and publish them. Which means, for example, that if you don't have somebody in France who is a good translator and who can translate from Gujarati to French directly, you will not see a Gujarati novel or a Gujarati book translated into French. With the best will in the world, that crucial link is missing. With the United States, even though I said forget them, but I will give you a negative example which helps us to forget them, which is the total percentage of translated books in the United States from across the world, I think is no more than 7. Somebody gave me the statistic a while ago and I have not rechecked it out. Sorry?
7%.
1%, okay. All right.
Exactly.
So, as we say in India, aapke muh mein ghee shakkar, meaning may your mouth be full of butter and sugar for having said something that makes me happy. It's actually, but anyway, 1%. In France, the number of the percentage, I think, is as high as 30. I think 30% is translated books. Now, of that 30%, probably the majority are from UK and US. So all the big names, Stephen King, etc., get translated. Now, forget India and the United States. Even look at these exchanges, which are not bound by the same structures of power. You know, why should there not be a curiosity in the United States about French literature? Why should there not be a curiosity about Italian or German or then the other European countries? There does not seem to be, for many of the reasons that Vishakha is pointing out. So for Indian literature in Indian languages to make its way there is that much more difficult. And it needs a lot of really imagination, commitment, money, competence, capability before it can be done.
Let me just say a couple of things one about each of what you said. The distinction Vishakha made between the travel of languages through translation and the travel of ideas, which is a different notion. Looking at the travel of ideas, do we need a concept? I'm trying to think what's the best way to express it. But do we need some notion, not of a natural language vernacular, but a conceptual vernacular, which is a different idea. That is to say, if I want to convince you, or you want to convince me about the importance of human rights, it's not at all obvious that I have the idea perfectly well in my conceptual repertory, but not in the idiom of rights. That it's in a conceptual vernacular. Natural language vernacular is not the point here, but it's an ideational vernacular, and what we need to seek is to tap the conceptual vernacular of different parts of the world. And of course, natural language vernacular would have to pay attention to that kind of thing, but it could be done within English too. It's very seldom done.
Absolutely.
And maybe NGOs and all are willy-nilly forced to seek conceptual vernacular so that they don't come off as you know, alien, brutish intrusions into. So that's one thought, that we maybe need to coin the idea of a conceptual vernacular and pursue it.
I mean, partly, just so if I understand it correctly, partly what we are talking about, therefore, is certain level of nuance, cultural specificity around ideas that seem universal, that actually need to be uncovered so that we don't put it all into some generalized, globalized language.
I mean, here's an example. It's an example about something we are all obsessed by, in America anyway, and that is Islam. Now, it's obvious to anybody who knows any Muslim or any culture in which there's a predominantly Muslim population that there's an enormous amount of de facto secularity amongst Muslims. But it's de facto. They don't declare themselves. I mean, you put a microphone in somebody's face and they say, and ask them, do you believe that your society should be entirely ruled by the Sharia? They're not going to say no. But if you actually look at their lives, the Sharia, and it's playing no role whatsoever in it. I mean, this is actually true even of the heartland of America. You ask somebody, do you believe in creationism? They're not going to say no. But the idea that creationism plays any serious role in their lives is absurd. So there's a lot of de facto secularity, which, given the kind of Cold War there is against Islam and so on, never gets on the surface, but it turns on detecting conceptual vernacularity of cultures
and how to uncover that, how to give it voice. This is the issue,
And the other thing that was raised by you about power, Urvashi, I'm just curious, and America being a distinctly parochial.
Well, all book markets. I mean, the Indian market's also parochial. It's not only America. All book markets are interested in their own. It's so much easier to access your.
But did I detect that America is particularly insular in a way that France, say, is
Exactly.
is
That's
not?
the point.
That came through
Right.
in some exchange just now.
I mean, just the fact that 30% of publications in France are out of translation,
Yeah.
whereas in America it's only 1%, says something about...
Well, it's 1-2% of it's in that line. And when you say America gets away with it, I would argue not anymore because of America's involvement in the rest of the world.
Well, this is the point I was wondering, Salman, and that is that, you see, America's imperialism, unlike French and British, was very often done by proxy. You didn't go and settle in a place, so you didn't get the willy-nilly cosmopolitanism that comes from actually going somewhere and conquering it, and but I mean, Mexico it did, so the Spanish element is different.
And the Philippines doesn't count,
But Philippines, but most of its links with other parts of the world, say Latin America, Africa, and so on, has been done by proxy. It's been done by the methods which were not by, which is not true of France and England. So that may be part of the reason why it's just much more insular in cultural and.
But I think what's ironic, though, is that while that's very true, this is the country where everybody from everywhere comes. So to some extent, it is ironic that a whole lot of people come from a whole lot of places.
Yeah.
And Vartan Gregorian would say, a great American scholar of Iranian origin, that every single immigrant who comes to America redefines what it means to be American. Yeah. And I've often said, and then, therefore, also actually redefines what it means to be who one is,
right.
And yet there is this ironic relationship between parochial and cosmopolitan in terms of experience. And
but also, Akeel, sorry to interrupt, but I think the same sort of statistic, I mean, I find what you're saying really interesting, but I'm just wondering, the same sort of statistic would hold true for the UK and translations in the UK. And equally, it would hold true for Italy, Germany, and many European countries who translate much more than their works are translated out. And the exchange is largely from English to those languages. So I'm not sure whether...
There is the English as a lingua franca idea that you were trying to suggest.
And since we're mentioning English, I'd like to pick up a very interesting conversation we had before this panel. We mentioned Indian writers writing in English precisely, and very naively, I thought that they had in mind a global audience. But as you said, that's not the case for everyone. Right. Maybe you could expatiate on this?
Sure. We were, just before this panel, we were talking about what Damien was interested in is that there are younger writers in India who write in English, and they have huge circulation, much more than many serious writers who are here. One of them is Chetan Bhagat. Some of you know his name. There are a number of other writers like that. Not necessarily very well-written novels, at least from most of our points of view, but they capture the aspiration of young, urban, middle-class Indians, and they reflect their life, and they therefore reflect also the presence of globalizing phenomenon back in India. But as he was asking, he thought that was something about trying to capture this international market. And both Urvashi and I said that actually it's entirely not about that. It is about capturing the Indian young youth market. And there is such a huge number that he actually doesn't need to think about anywhere else. There are millions and millions of copies that he can set right there. Doesn't need to go anywhere. So it's a different way of using English within the subcontinent.
Yeah, no, also I don't think that those books travel easily.
Right.
I mean, it's not as if the agents who work with these 2 or 3 authors who are doing really well haven't tried to sell those books internationally, but they don't resonate. Not even, I mean, so far, not even in countries which might have a similar contemporary history, you know, like Philippines, where call centers and the sort of things he's talking about are not so very different. They are very local.
But you know, speaking of, in fact, Bhagat, the book that got turned into Three Idiots. This is a very famous, very popular Bollywood movie. I was shocked when I had a group of students from China, and they saw me, recognized that I was of Indian origin, and the thing they wanted to talk about the most was Three Idiots.
Three Idiots?
Absolutely. So, in fact, it's about a movie about sort of the pressures of education and rote learning and where you get creativity. And they were telling me that for students in Chinese universities, this was the #1 popular film. And so there's another kind of transnational global connection. So we actually laughed and said that we really should bring Chinese students and Indian students together to talk about Three Idiots and its implication for education.
Yeah. Chetan Bhagat will be delighted to hear
Exactly.
that. Sorry? He wouldn't, you think? For Three Idiots, but it's
yes,
his
that's
story.
true. He didn't
yes,
get enough credit
yes.
for the movie, yes.
So he can take reflected because it's his story that led to the film.
So before the question from the audience, I'd like to close our conversation with the last question. I don't think we can mention globalization and literature without bringing up the name of Salman Rushdie, who wrote in English, who had an international audience, and who somehow was the embodiment of a world novel or of a world literature. So I was wondering, is Salman Rushdie is Salman Rushdie's approach to literature still valid today? Could we today have another Midnight Children or another what was the name, Satanic Verses today, or has globalization, as far as literature is concerned, gone one step further, or has it changed? That's my question.
You should start, Akeel.
Urvashi, you know of the reception of Salman in India much more, and I really want to hear you speak about that. But you know, I think the thing about Salman is there's a wonderful thing that Mukul Kesavan told me. Mukul Kesavan wrote a novel a few years ago. I forget its title now. And he said he presented it to Salman.
Looking Through Glass.
Looking Through Glass.
Looking Through Glass.
He presented it to Salman. And in it he inscribed the words, to Salman, thank you for the 4-minute mile. Which is, you know, Roger Bannister broke the barrier, and then a whole range of other people began to break the 4-minute barrier in the mile race. And there's no doubt that it was a very galvanizing novel. I mean, you know, half my friends in India became novelists after. I couldn't call somebody in India without them saying I'm in the midst of writing a novel. You know, after that, so it was a very mobilizing book, the Satanic Verses. And then the Midnight Children. But then the Satanic Verses created a quite different trajectory. I mean, we can talk about it, but it's a quite different set of issues that it raises. And there is a question that I have for you, partly because you're the native informant. We are all domiciled abroad. And that is, I'm just very curious, and this may be a question that intrigues you too, Damian. Why is it that, I mean, in my case, but in a lot of people's case, and I think we share this instinct, why is it that we feel so much more sympathy for Husain, who was also pillarized for being blasphemous towards a religion, than we do towards Salman Rushdie, even though we defend Salman Rushdie's freedom of speech, etc. But it's just a fact about really exceptionlessly everybody I know, that they feel far greater sympathy for Husain, the artist, who was, suffered from the same religious bigotry, so on, than Salman Rushdie. What is this asymmetry due to?
It's very interesting.
And what does it say about us and the world? It's just a question.
You know, I mean, you've got two major questions there. The first about Rushdie. I think it's quite right to recognize Rushdie's pioneering role in opening up the doors of making the art of writing the art of the possible, I mean, for many writers. But it's also important to recognize its limitations. I know this sounds like a terribly, this is what you would expect from a native informant, but I don't mean it that way. I think it's also important to recognize its limitations because it opened the doors for English writers. And it opened the doors for them to enter into the international world. And yet there are many comparable writers in the Indian languages who have not had that kind of access. So in a sense, it opened the doors for the already privileged, which is not to discount it, but I think just to note the limitedness of that phenomenon. I mean, you have writers like Shankar in Bengali who sells millions of copies, but or Sunil Gangopadhyay or others, Anantamurthy, who are at least as important in literary terms and so on. So I think that there's always a need for perspective on that. And your second question about why is it that there's generally more sympathy for someone like Husain than there is for Salman? I think many reasons, and I think many of them are tied in with nationalism. Husain never wanted to give up his Indian identity. Salman is always an Indian who has lived abroad. Husain was forced to live abroad. He always carried inside him this dream of coming back to India. He was an older man, so the mortality was pretty much at the door. So that also, I think, entered. And also, I think that many people did not want to be associated with the majority fundamentalism which acted against Husain and wanted to distance themselves in terms of being secular. And so there was more sympathy with him, whereas with Salman, they did not know what to make of this strange animal, because Salman also has a kind of, I don't know, arrogance about him, if you like, and it just entered the picture of, the sympathy got a bit diluted, thinking, who's this man? He thinks a lot of himself, that kind of thing. It's that kind of thing that you need this person and you hate the person as well. You value him and you hate him as well. With Husain, I don't think. I mean, Husain spent all his life in India except the last few years.
I think also with Husain, let's not forget that as one of the early, very important progressives, he's as much about making of modern India in the visual arts. He is a very hallowed role and a place, which in fact Salman never had. And on top of it, when the fatwa happens for satanic verses, it's actually the so-called liberal forces in Rajiv Gandhi's government that are bringing out saying that this book should be banned. So it creates a complication for progressives in India as to what do you do about this? And that is not the complication around Husain. So it really is quite different. So it's nice that you bring Salman, because clearly it's a watershed in some ways, but as you're pointing out, there's also some other kinds of limitations. It's a particular kind of writing that also then gets privileged. So that also is something to pay attention to.
Okay. So the mention or even the invocation of Salman Rushdie will be a fitting conclusion to our conversation. Now I would like you in the audience to ask questions. So feel free.
have a question about another field which is not literature but connected to it, which is philosophy. And when we think back to the Greeks in philosophy and in literature, the plays of the great Greek authors, which are translated into a variety of languages, even though in the course of the history of philosophy, there are many different philosophies, but they all seem to get a say in different countries and in different languages. And what is it about literature that is so different from philosophy in this regard? Because it isn't that philosophers have the ultimate truth, otherwise they would have stopped writing a long time ago. But what's the difference between the two? And that's basically my question for the philosopher.
I see. Yeah. You know, I'm going to only just talk about India because that's the domain that we are focused on. Yeah? My sense from going for some 30 years to India every year, every winter, and speaking with philosophers and speaking at philosophy departments in Indian metropoles, is that there is one sense in which philosophy has become ossified in India. Let me give you just an anecdotal sense of it. And this happened to me, I was speaking at Delhi University and I asked somebody in the audience, what do you think about, I think the subject of our thing was human freedom and determinism. And so I said, what do you think about freedom? And his answer was, Shankara says this. And there's a real sense in which people don't do philosophy in philosophy departments. In the 20th century, India had perhaps one of the greatest philosophers in the history of any philosophy, and that was Gandhi. He was a tremendous philosopher. He was a moral philosopher. He was a political philosopher. He was a great thinker. He was a great anti-imperialist thinker, and it came from his philosophy. I think he was the greatest anti-imperialist thinker ever, greater than Lenin and greater than Fanon, and greater than Said. But he was, nevertheless, it came from his philosophy. Nobody studies Gandhi as a philosopher. Historians study him, but not philosophy departments. So in that sense, philosophy is just more exciting in France and in the United States than it is in India. On the other hand, there are real problems of arcane idioms, yes, philosophy is synonymous with the history of philosophy in India, and that's why it's become stagnant.
I think you asked an interesting question, which is what is the difference between literature and philosophy? And I go back to literature in the terms of arts, that arts kind of give you insight into what it means to be human in a way that's intuitive, that's affective, and therefore there is a way that we can relate to it. We can get lost in a book, and it takes you to another world, and it is about imagination. And that idea of imagination creates a kind of accessibility that obviously makes it possible in the global arena to connect through the arts. That's quite different and unique from other things. This question?
So I have a two-part question. The first part is just about statistics to put your conversation about the English being lingua franca into perspective. I was wondering what percentage of, you may not know this, literate Indians speak English, and what percentage of literate French people speak English? That's the first question. Second question is, Amit Chaudhry said something. He said, everyone hear me? He said, he thinks it means something to be Indian, but he's not sure if it means anything to be an Indian writer. And I thought that was an apt question, because I'm thinking about, I don't know if this is too loud or, I'm thinking about, you know, in subcontinentals writing in English. And yes, of course, there's going to be a difference between someone from Pakistan who writes about Karachi and someone from India who writes about Calcutta. But there's also a difference between an American who writes about life in New York and an American who writes about life in Louisiana. And yet they're still American writers. And I think about the subcontinent. This is a conference a festival on Indian writers. There's no Pakistani writer here. And I'm wondering, is there a value in that, really? And I think of H.M. Naqvi. He writes about the fall of the Twin Towers. And it's really considered almost an American, you know, coming-of-age story. It's about America. He had a tough time selling it in the UK because it's so American. But he's Pakistani, and he's writing in English, and he's based in Karachi. Talk about what you think about what does it mean to be an Indian writer? Does it have value? Does it have meaning? And if not, why aren't there any Pakistanis here?
Well, I mean, I would say, in answer to your first question, there is no clear statistic, but it is said that about 10% of India's population is English speaking. How many of them read English, we don't know. But 10% is a huge number, although it's small in terms of the larger percentage. And the influence or importance of that population is much greater than the percentage that it occupies. What does it mean to be an Indian writer? Does it have any value? I think all the questions that you raise are really important. And I don't think there's a straight answer to that. It is really, I think, a writer's choice in which way he or she wishes to be identified, which is not to say that a choice is not full of problems and complexities. I mean, I don't think we can answer your question about why there are no Pakistanis here. I would be delighted if there were Pakistani writers here, because it makes for a really interesting conversation. But I think your question is, really many of my writers, I publish basically women writers. And many of my writers resent being identified as women writers. They further resent being identified as Indian women writers. Many of them live between India and elsewhere. Many of them live only elsewhere. Some live in cities in India, some live in villages in India. I mean, what's the commonality? What does nationality mean? Where does that notion of identity come from? You look at a writer like Amin Malouf, lives in France, has a history of Lebanese Christianity, has a history of Islam, writes in many languages. What does it mean to be identified as an XYZ writer? But if you ask me personally, and somebody asked me how would you identify yourself as a writer, which I am only peripherally, but I would say as an Indian woman writer, because to me, both of those labels are very important. They give meaning to what I write. But if somebody else doesn't wish to own those labels, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think this is a really very important and interesting question, which is, again, I'll give you an answer by an anecdote. I was at the Asia Society, we were working on a major contemporary art exhibition. And essentially, we initially were working on the Indian artists. And there was a big discussion about whether we were going to have artists only based in India, or artists who are also in a diaspora, or artists of Indian origin, quarter Indian origin, or whatever. And the curator, Chaitanya Sambrani, and I said, there is something about an Indian artist living in India and that experience that is somewhat different from the person who is living in New York or Brooklyn and creating art. And I just said in my own family, my sister who lives in India all the time, comes to America, goes back and forth, but her home is there. she does have a way of experiencing that is different from the way I experience living in New York, having lived in America for 40 years. Having said that, one of the things I think that what anthropologists have helped us with now is that actually this idea of fixed identity is very problematic. So that I often say I have at least 6 identities. Sometimes I truly am an Indian living in America. Sometimes I'm an American who happens to be from India. Sometimes I'm an Asian American. And sometimes I'm truly a Gujarati girl who lives in New York. And each one of these are quite specific and contextually based, and I can see the difference. So it's very important, I think, for all of us not to pigeonhole people one way or the other. And just a word about why no Pakistani artists. I know there was a lot of discussion whether this should be a South Asian writer thing or just Indian. And part of it was to recognize that there was some difference in the way perhaps Indian experience works that might be different from the Pakistani. And at another time you might do South Asia, but this time you'll try to limit it to Indian writers. And also there's the sheer scale of writers in English as well as other language from Indian origin. So that was one of the reasons. But I think one can always say no categories are appropriate because a writer is a writer is a writer, and artisan is artisan and artist. But some categories also help. And the question is, are they used to pigeonhole people, or are they used in a way to understand where they're coming from based on what they want to be seen? So I hope that's helpful.
Okay. I think, I'm sorry, but I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we'll have to stop here. Well, thank you to all of you, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Damien.
Thank you.